Thank you, first of all, for being here. This is the last in our series on the American Jobs Plan. I really get the feeling the focus is jobs. I don't know why. I'm just getting that feeling. Laura, do you want to talk us in and then we'll get started?
I would, that's fine. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura DeVoe. I'm one of the advisory board members here at Build the Era. And we are very pleased to have you here for our final, it's our final, right? Webinar on the American Jobs Plan. And tonight is all about jobs. And if you are new to Build the Era is an education and advocacy organization focused on transportation and infrastructure as it relates to the Department of Transportation, the DOT. We are volunteer founded and volunteer powered by supporters, volunteers, and staffers from the Pete Buttigieg 2020 presidential campaign, as well as folks who have now found to Pete and are excited about transportation. And the Build the Era's purpose is to connect citizens from across America to the DOT by educating and informing the public as to what the DOT does and doesn't do and why it matters, educating and informing the public to the role that the infrastructure plays in America's quality of life, providing training and guidance on how to engage with local and federal elected officials on matters related to the DOT, and finally, providing training and guidance on how to advocate for causes using relational organizing as a primary tool. We have had an amazing series of webinars on the American Jobs Plan, as well as several webinars on how to advance yourself in terms of this organization, how to organize locally. And if you have missed any of our webinars, we please invite you to our YouTube channel. Please, while you're there, check out all of our videos, as well as go back to buildtheera.com, our website, and follow us on all our social media. So now I'm going to turn things over to our gurus in residence, Jeannie and Jonathan.
And I think Jonathan's going to share his screen.
Oh, that would be something I need to do.
So you have to let him.
Yes, I had one job. I had one job here.
And if you're following Twitter, it's been exciting to see the unions supporting jobs. And not surprising to see that Jonathan and I are going to talk about unions and how important labor is. The other thing Bill and I were talking about earlier, our last webinar, when we talked about I-45 and social equity, we talked about how TxDOT was their own reviewer. They're the ones who signed their own record of decision on the I-45 project. And today, US DOT said, let's look back into that. So it's kind of a foxes in the hen house. The TxDOT is approving their own document, which is kind of unusual. So we're going to start off with jobs, and asterisk, no college degree required. So this is our part 4 on the American Jobs Plan. Next slide. Can you advance?
Are you seeing my screen right now?
I see your screen.
It's being
but
paused.
It looks like
That's
you're
interesting. Hold on, something's
yeah, it
funky
looks like
here.
your full screen.
Okay, let's see what's going on here. How about that? Let's go back to that one. Now, can you see?
Yes.
All right, so let's go back to this one. Sorry.
Okay, perfect. And we had arranged ourselves by these FTA regions. So I'm in region 10, Jonathan's in region 1. Just know where you are by region. Next slide is an outline of what we're going to talk about. So a look back at ARA. And then Jonathan's going to talk about unions and right to work. We'll talk about the apprenticeships and national service and job readiness, and then the AJP and what it has in it, and we'll just answer your questions. So the next slide, does anybody remember what ARA stands for?
Yeah.
Wrong answers only. Okay, so next slide, or next advance.
Yep.
If everybody remembers back in 2006 and the subprime mortgage origination and the chaos when those subprime mortgages came due, and lots of failures in the housing market led to lots of foreclosures and our Great Recession. So the next slide shows the level of unemployment that followed that, and after that, the next slide or next advance. So ARA was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. When Obama came into office, he had a lot of stuff to clean up. Next, it was a response to the Great Recession from 2007, December 7th, 2007 to June 2009. Next is 7% of our jobs were lost, 8.7 million jobs totally, and the unemployment rate, as you can see, teetered at 10%. And the next slide. So what is ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act? It was about 787 billion. You can see the next slide where that went to. 288 billion of that was tax relief. And then state and local fiscal relief. You're seeing a lot of the same elements today in the Recovery Act and other CARES Act. And then 111 billion in infrastructure and science. So what did that 111 billion go to? Next slide is about the Tiger program. Oh, look back at our primary objective of this federal statute was to save existing jobs and create new ones as soon as possible. So the notion of getting people back to work as quickly as possible was, pervasive in the Tiger Act, and the result of that was looking for projects that were opportunities, shovel ready, something we could construct right away. And today you hear a lot of a little bit of controversy about that shovel readiness. You'll hear Pete talk about shovel worthiness. So the thought was that we invested maybe a lot into projects that didn't really do good and great things. Hard to get all the good things you want out of a program like this, but the focus of this was really just to get people working as soon as possible. So the next slide is what was Tiger? Tiger was the transportation grant program. They've had Tiger grants every year for about a decade. And one of the first Tiger years was a project I'll talk about specifically. So Tiger, next slide, it was focused on transportation investments generating economic recovery. And how are you going to do this? Well, just as an example, in 1990, Washington State, just a little bit back, passed something called the Growth Management Act. And in response to what we saw as sprawl around the country, the state said, we're going to put hard lines around urban growth. And within that urban growth area, that's where we want all the development to happen, all of the growth. And outside of that, we want to preserve our natural resources. We also want to make urban growth more effective and efficient. So transit systems, utilities within would be effective and efficient. You're not building 10 miles of a water line out to some community out in the hinterlands, because that's just not efficient. So as part of the Growth Management Act, a lot of density is being pulled into the city of Seattle. And around 2006, the city of Seattle started to look and started to recognize some of the pressure. This is South Lake Union, and you can see in 2006, it was pretty mild, low density development. See a lot of parked cars, see a lot of parking lots. Most of the development here is 1 and 2 story buildings. The city had started to upzone and plan for upzoning this, but not 30-story buildings. It's more like a wedding cake to take advantage of this. This is the edge of South Lake Union on the top. To do that, they looked at investments. This is the Mercer Street corridor, and it's a one-way couplet. It was built as a one-way couplet. The other thing is on the left side of the map is SR 99, which was a surface arterial that connected to SR 99, the viaduct, and eventually that viaduct is vulnerable, going to come down, and we're going to rebuild this whole area. So in 2006, they started planning. I worked on this project called Mercer, and next slide. Back then, the inbound trips were this S curve in, and next slide, there's the outbound trips were this straight line out. So it's very convoluted, and the Mercer corridor plan would make this a one-way. It would take away this one-way couplet and make both streets two-way. So the next slide is in 2016, just a decade later, we straightened out that road and made it two-way. The street we cut the ribbon on this in 2012, but you can also see a lot of the other things that happened there. So click down a couple. This is 2016, click down one more time. And the couplet is now on the same corridor. Next, click down one more.
Oh.
So it's a two-way roadway in 2012. The other thing you can see here is these little white buildings. They're all upzoned buildings. You can see, and click one more time. You can see a lot of things that happened here. The Gates Foundation took over this empty lot. South Lake Union Park became what was an armory, and some industrial buildings became this lovely park. The corridor that was between those two couplets was parking, and it's under construction. You'll see in the next picture. Paul Allen's Institute, a lot of Amazon buildings. This is South Lake Union Park. It's just beautiful and a lovely place to go, urban environment. And then that's the Gates picture of the Gates Foundation. And then the next slide is in 2020, just recently, a lot of those buildings you can see start to fill in. So this is quite a bit of upzoning. And again, they've recently upzoned it again for even more density. You can see over here, 99 is now a tunnel, and this is a tunnel portal over by the Gates Foundation. So you can see what's happening with what happened with this Tiger investment. So next slide, what did Tiger do? Tiger is transportation infrastructure generating economic recovery. In 2007, so before the road opened, this is the Amazon headquarters campus. And then next was, this is what some of the area looked like. This is Lenora, and click down, this is what happened. So very car oriented, saw a lot of parking lots. Now the Amazon spheres are there, it's very walkable, low impact development. You won't find a lot of parked cars, and you'll find a lot more people walking. Next is so that shovel readiness project was just the opportunity to take advantage of this program that put big dollars into infrastructure because it just was available and opportunistic. So the next slide, it was the Mercer corridor got $30 million, applied for $30 million, got $30 million, and of a $100 million project. The $100 million sounds like a lot of money, but it rebuilt all of the infrastructure underneath. The utilities were 100 years old. Next is what did that mean as far as economic recovery? The construction was completed in 2012, and then that same year, next was Amazon purchased about $1 billion worth of land here. They anticipated in 2008 that they would have about 4,000 employees next, and or 6,000. And then they ended up having next was, I think, 40,000 employees. Yep. In 2018, they had 40,000 employees. So the notion of economic recovery linked to land use and transportation, it's a no-brainer. And the next is kind of some headlines. At the time, Amazon gambled up gobbled up the campus for $1 billion. And this is in 2012, right, as they were cutting the ribbon for the corridor. So these things are inextricably linked. And the next is, what does that also mean for the area? During the pandemic, all those employees were working at home. So there was a lot of pressure for Amazon employees to come back to the headquarters, because that all the businesses around there rely on Amazon employees for restaurants, et cetera. So, so the restaurants and small businesses around there rely also, their employment also is dependent on Amazon. It's a no-brainer, but just shows how infrastructure has this impact and relationship to jobs. And then that's really what the corridor looks like, just a little bit. If you want to know more about bioswales and low impact development, I could tell you more, but these are all of the water that's on the corridor gets treated on the corridor, doesn't have to be carted away and cleaned. And then we put in some nice pedestrian crossings. You can see it's a really nice street. And that's the story of the Mercer corridor. Next.
So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about unions and union jobs. These two pictures both represent unions. The first one over on the left, you look at it, that's kind of when people think unions, they think of picketing, signs, that's power, union power showing right there. But then you've got the picture over to the right, and that's also showing union power. That's actually my local. I belong to the Maine Service Employees Association, which is Local 1989 of the Service Employees International Union, otherwise known as SEIU. So both of these are SEIU unions, both showing, worker power. One happens to be at a demonstration. The other one, this is our annual meeting where we're actually voting on our budget, voting on things, and members, are doing this. This is all member run, member driven. That's a big key for unions. So what is a union? Basically, it's an organized group of workers that collectively bargain with employers for contracts that contain wages and benefits, as well as address working conditions. And as I mentioned, the leaders are elected from the membership ranks. You always hear about union bosses. Well, the union bosses are elected by the members. That's an important thing to remember whenever you kind of hear that term thrown around. The members are the ones who choose who they want to lead them. And unions really focus, a lot on contract enforcement. Basically, there's a grievance process built into these contracts. So if the employer, does do something against the contract, employees can basically, who are covered by the bargaining agreement, can raise a grievance, and the union has to represent them in that, and also arbitrations. But unions also do a lot of political advocacy. And, they have to, because essentially, all of the stuff in politics affects all of the stuff that unions are representing. I mean, workers are represented, by these unions, and so they do need to be politically active. But really, the whole theme behind unions is solidarity. Unions are only as strong as their members' activism. That's really what makes a union strong. It's what gives it its power. What gives it its influence is having those members take action, and take action collectively. So some of the most known unions out there, you have the National Education Association, you have SEIU, as I'd mentioned, you have AFSCME, you have AFL-CIO, you have the Teamsters, UFCW, United Auto Workers, American Federation of Teachers, the International Brotherhood of Electric Workers, and the United Steelworkers. So those are kind of the names you hear quite a lot. There are a lot more unions out there, but those are kind of your main players nationally. But with all these unions, there are only 10.8% of wage and salary workers in the U.S. are currently unionized. So that's a fairly small number, considering the amount, of unions that are out there. But it has actually ticked up, but it's nowhere near where it was, in the 1950s and 60s, where union power really had its peak. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But I mentioned the collective, the unions really, the contract piece of it, collective bargaining. That's really, how these contracts are negotiated. It's negotiation of wages and other conditions of employment by an organized body of employees or a union. And really what collective bargaining depends on is good faith bargaining. You have give and take on both sides. Both sides are willing to participate into the process and exchange proposals. And really when you have, good faith bargaining, the workers and the employers benefit from that. The workers get the security, they get terms and things in the contract that make conditions better. And the employers get a reliable workforce. They get the workforce that has, good morale, and the productivity goes up as well. So, it's really a benefit for employers to participate in that collective bargaining process. So there are some steps to that. Really, negotiation is the ideal. You negotiate a contract, you go through with the employer, you negotiate it, then you come up with a tentative agreement. You send that agreement out for ratification, and then you implement it. But if that fails, if you can't get to negotiation, you can bring in a third-party mediator. You can have what's called a fact finding, which is essentially you have basically three parties. Each side chooses a representative, and then you have a third party that both sides agree on, and they issue kind of a non-binding determination. And then you have arbitration, where you can have binding and you can also have non-binding on certain items, depending on the collective bargaining agreement, depending on kind of the state and the state law that exists and the process that's there. But if all else fails, basically, if any time in this process that the employers refuse to come to the table, a lot of workers can actually engage in a strike. When the employers can actually have a lockout. And we've seen this, countless times through US history, but that is kind of sort of the last resort to try to get parties back to the table. So we do have quite a history of labor in the US, and I won't go through everything here, but I do want to pick out some certain key dates. Really, unions really formed because of the Industrial Revolution, working conditions, the labor practices that were out there. I mean, you had 60 to 70-hour work weeks. You basically had manufacturing sweatshops, child labor, really not a lot of safety measures. And it was a lot of immigrant labor as well. So the thing that kind of, I think, woke people up the most as far as the conditions was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City in 1911. You had 146 workers that were killed in that, and the majority of them were young Italian and Jewish immigrant women. And what happened was basically there were 3 floors, and the middle floor was basically trapped. So you had people actually jumping to their desks the street below because they couldn't get out. And somebody who happened to be an observer of this horrific thing was actually Frances Perkins, who was eventually FDR's Secretary of Labor. And so she actually had taken some action, formed a committee on public safety for New York City to go through and look at all these factories. And at the same time, the New York State Legislature had New York State Senator Robert Wagner, who eventually would author, as you can see, the Wagner Act down below. So you kind of had 2 key players come out of this, this tragedy, really pushing for labor rights, in the future and become major players. So, and then we moved to 1935, where we had the National Labor Relations Act. And this is basically what set up, collective bargaining and everything for everybody. It set up the National Labor Relations Board as kind of a Supreme Court for labor. And it really, this is what gave, unions their boost moving forward. So of course, because unions started to gain power, we move now where corporations start to try to take that back. And the first evidence of that was the Taft-Hartley Act. This ended the ability for unions to have secondary strikes. And what that is when a union goes and actually encourages another bargaining group, another union workers to go on strike. It legitimized, there were only a handful of what's called right to work laws in the United States, and this legitimized those and recognized them federally. And it also allowed employers to wage anti-union campaigns, so they could actually take their employees and put them in a room and give them, basically information on why they should join a union. That was all from the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. So you go through and labor just kind of kept getting chipped away at. Although in 1962, President Kennedy allowed federal employees to unionize, so that really started spiking the public sector unions. But then, in 1970s, you had the Republican administrations there with Nixon and Ford basically installing these management labor lawyers, essentially called union buster lawyers, onto the National Labor Relations Board, and they would issue decisions that would essentially make it easier for companies to ship all those unionized jobs now overseas. And then it kind of, the height of this whole thing was in 1981, when President Reagan, you had these PATCO air traffic controllers who were going to go on strike, and he famously fired those striking workers. And that really sent kind of a shiver down, collectively down labor's spine, and it really kind of weakened, labor in this country. I mean, that was kind of the moment. And then further down in history, and more recently, you had in 2013 through 2015, Michigan and Wisconsin, traditionally major, union states, states where, we had, the United Auto Workers, you had, these powerful unions, they became right to work states. And then finally in 2018, you had the Janus versus AFSCME decision, and we'll talk about that in a second. But these charts here show, you can see kind of how that whole relationship happened. You see how productivity and compensation are kind of on the same trajectory right up until the 1970s when those jobs start going overseas. And then that's when you see union membership start to decline, and yet in compensation kind of stagnates and then just slightly increases. And while productivity continues on its trajectory and union membership continues to decline. And then the next one we got here, and I mentioned 1962, you can really see that spike for public sector. So while the private sector union membership was dropping, public sector had actually spiked, peaked really in the kind of late 1970s, and then kind of stagnated, but maintained its strength. So of course, you've got the private sector unionship going down, public sector, kind of staying the same. I think we all know where the target's going next. And that was, the public sector, public sector union strength. Corporations definitely wanted to try to put a check on that. So they had tried multiple times before. The first case really brought to the Supreme Court that really had the momentum was Friedrichs versus the California Teachers Association in 2015. And basically the argument was that workers shouldn't have to pay a service fee for representation. And we'll talk about that with right to work, but they called it a violation of their First Amendment rights because they didn't believe in the political beliefs that union was basically taking action on, even though they didn't have to actually pay those fees for political activity, and their money didn't go to political activity. They still thought it was a violation of their First Amendment rights. So this seemed to be headed for passage because of the court makeup at the time. But then in 2016, before the decision, Justice Scalia passed away, which essentially deadlocked the court at 4-4, kicking it down to the lower court decision, which upheld the service fees. So then we all know what happened next. President Obama appointed Merrick Garland. He never got a hearing. It was held open. President Trump gets elected, and he appoints Neil Gorsuch. And that brought it back to a 5-4 conservative majority. This Janus versus AFSCME case was brought up before the Supreme Court. And in 2018, a 5-4 decision against AFSCME overturned the original case, which allowed service fees. And now, as a result, all 50 states are essentially right to work for the public sector. And what is right to work? So right to work really kind of isn't what it seems like, when you just think of the term. What it means is that an employee does not have to pay a service fee to be represented by a union in bargaining and grievances. And federal and state labor laws require unions to represent everyone they bargain for exclusively. So what this does is it requires unions to spend resources on non-members. And it's an attempt to weaken their overall efforts by limiting that revenue that's coming in. And right now we have 28 states that are right to work states for the private sector, and all 50, as I had mentioned, were effectively right to work for the public sector. But the important thing to remember is even in a right to work state, right to work does not prohibit a union from forming or continuing to exist. So right to work does not mean a union cannot form in that state. So it was interesting that there were some conversations, I think, on the House committee when Secretary Pete was going through and getting questions asked. He was saying, well, these states, we're going to be put at a disadvantage because we're a right to work state. Well, right to work states can still have unionized employees. So, that kind of misconception there that right to work means no union, not necessarily, but it means that the union can't get all the resources that it really should. So in right to work states, you got wages. They're 3.1% lower on average. In 2019, 24% of jobs were low wage in right to work states compared with only 14.5% in non-right to work states. You had 36% higher than average discrimination complaints to the EEOC, those coming from those right to work states. And you have 37% more worksite fatalities in right to work states. So those are some key figures there where right to work really isn't what people try to make it out to be. It really does put workers and their families at a disadvantage. So getting back to the importance of union jobs, one of the biggest things, importance of union jobs is they come with those benefits. You can see there that union jobs have better access to paid sick leave benefits and better access to health care. And another key to that is that you have stronger earnings growth, of course. You can see the top 10 states had 18.2% earnings growth, whereas the bottom 10 states in union membership had only 11.4%. And then that trend kind of goes for upward mobility as well, your economic mobility. Your highly unionized states, more economically mobile. Your bottom unionized states, not as mobile. And then downward mobility, it flips. Obviously your heavily unionized states don't have as much downward mobility, whereas your less unionized states do. And that really affects, not only families as well, and especially kids. A study done by the American Center for Progress found that basically a 10% increase in a geographic area's union membership basically gives low-income children a 1.3% percentile higher than the national income distribution. And then as far as for all kids, a 10% increase is associated with a 4.5% increase in the income of the area's kids. So, that economic mobility, you see that through time, is that, lower income people have an opportunity to advance higher than those folks who are in non-unionized areas. So that's why, even if you're not, in a union family, even if you don't have a union job, if you live in an area that's heavily unionized, you have a lot more chance for economic success. And so that gets us back to, it's not the American Jobs Plan, but there is really an important bill called the PRO Act, or the Protect the Right to Organize. This would be the most transformational legislation since the Wagner Act. It overturns a lot of the Taft-Hartley things that were in there. You can see those right there. It overturns right to work in those states that don't actually have those laws on the books and just are basically have it effectively through the Supreme Court decision. It allows secondary strikes again. And it curtails that ability because it doesn't allow those anti-union behaviors. It doesn't allow employers to force their employees to basically listen to anti-union campaigns. It strengthens whistleblower protections, allows unions to vote in elections by phone or online, and it actually provides some penalties and consequences for those entities that don't comply with those from orders from the National Labor Relations Board. So it's a real key piece of legislation. I think it's kind of just like everything else, it's all gonna depend on the Senate. And right now, I don't think it has the votes, but it is a key. If it would be able to pass, it is a huge thing for labor if they would be able to get this. This would be, transformational compared to the last, 50 years or so. So with that, I will turn it back to Jeannie.
we have some good questions in the chat too. The other thing I wanted to talk about is ladders of opportunity and apprenticeships and workforce development. And I can't stress how important these are, especially in the public sector, where even if wages might be lower, there are opportunities to advance. And these two are things that we've seen, ebb and flow in the last couple decades. The Work Progress Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, things that were put forth during the FDR's administration, you could see the benefits of those. And those were jobs that were created by the administration with, outcomes expected. The Work Progress Administration was 8.5 million workers. You see their work, and the Civilian Conservation Corps all around the country. $30 per week was paid to the Civilian Conservation Corps for all the work they did in working in national parks or forest lands. And then in the 70s and 80s, there has always been this Job Training Act for low-income areas and underprivileged areas, urban areas called, and then there was one in 73 to 82 called the CETA, Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. And that was, it gave summer jobs to kids in high school, picking up trash, working in parks. And those are the kind of jobs that, keep people from other kinds of jobs. And I know in 1982, CETA was replaced by the Reagan administration. And in a lot of ways, those kids that relied on those jobs found other employment. And so that time led to quite a bit of urban blight and drug lords and drug wars. And that's where those kids found other employment. So those kinds of programs also are really great. Next slide. So how are those taken care of in the American Jobs Program? Another is ladders of opportunity in the public sector. And that in 2016, it was created to develop and enhance these initiatives to tools and standards that empower transportation leaders to connect and create workforce opportunities that lift Americans into the middle class. So that's, these are, as we said in the jobs title slide, no college degree required. There are a ton of jobs that don't require a college degree, but they are family wage jobs. And finding ways to advance those, finding ways to expand them, especially in the public sector. There are a ton of jobs that we can do. So in transportation, it's all the maintenance workers, and there's machinists, bus drivers even. There are these really great opportunities to provide that, and the Ladders of Opportunity was a program that helped advance that. Next slide. So the original American Jobs Plan, we call it the original because we know that we don't know what will come out of this. The first is from initial analysis, there would be 2.7 million direct jobs from all the work that's proposed. But that's really related to the construction. That's direct. When they say direct jobs, that means, in my Mercer example, that's the folks that built those roads during the 2 years of construction. The folks that put the concrete together, directly related to the construction. What they didn't talk about, and what we know to be true, is there are these secondary opportunities. And in the Mercer example, there was, all of Amazon, and then the secondary and tertiary development, all the restaurants and shops that serve that new development. So that's an important part of the American Jobs Plan, and kind of underwrites why this is so important. Jobs. In the American Jobs Plan, President Biden talks about all of it being made in America. They have set aside for historically Black colleges and universities and investments in STEM research, support for small business owners like myself, to help them to get into public sector work. And then there's a Climate Conservation Corps, just like that the work development jobs. So there's a ton of jobs in here. It's probably one of the most important parts of the American Jobs Plan. That's and something that hard to argue with, but something we want to make sure that people are aware of. So next slide. That's next one, and then we just want to open up for questions. And there are a couple in the chat. Do you want to
grab those first, Jeannie, from the chat?
let's do that. There was one about right to work. Jonathan, I do know that right to work is a very confusing term. First of all, we should brand it differently because it sounds like
It's called right to work for less. A lot of unions like to use that
Right.
term.
Yeah, we should find a way to rebrand it. Anyway, but the gig workers who are not part of unions would see it as a hindrance. But go ahead, Jonathan. Do you have any responses?
Just looking for the question here.
I'm seeing a lot of freelance workers talking down the PRO Act.
Oh, okay. Well, that's the thing is, a lot of it is, the concern about the dues. That's a common thing. But dues can always be set, depending on unions. Unions set their own dues. They take membership into account, I would say. Sometimes they put a lower rate on to start as, different bargaining units get in. So it all really depends. But the biggest thing is that you're collectively organized and you're part of an organization that can give you resources, to organize further and have, a collective voice to go up against whatever employer that you need to negotiate with. And, those individually, you're just not as strong as you are collectively. I mean, that's kind of the biggest thing that you learn in a union is that, that collective power is so strong and just, the people around you and everything. When you're part of one, it is something to be reckoned with.
I also think it's a rising tide lifts all boats
Yep.
kind of scenario. There you go. So we used to be told when I was part of a public works union, we were always told, and it bore out that bargaining collectively lifted our wages, and the payment, our union dues were chump change, pocket change compared to what the benefits
you get. Absolutely.
Right? Not losing
Yep.
your health care, not losing
Yep.
or getting a small hourly wage increase per year.
And the interesting thing is employers actually use the contracts to recruit. So once they're there.
Yeah, exactly. And then the contrast to that is, as gig workers, you always should be going into a negotiation. I'm a consultant, into a perspective of saying, I set my rate here because I know, a civil servant employee would charge this much, and I have to charge a little bit more for all the stuff, the printers, all of my overhead. So
Overhead, right.
So for your gig workers, as this comes up, you have justification to raise your salaries up as well. If those union jobs are declining, your job value is declining as well. You can't say, as those jobs decline in value, your job will, me as a consultant, my value.
And the collective bargaining also brings a fairness component too. So with the individuals, you can have unfair treatment, whereas if you bargain collectively, it's typically, fair for most, or if not all.
Yeah, and the economics is a part of it, but like you said, it's the ability to not be mistreated, or ability to bring claims, or have things raised.
Yeah, I see a question asking about service fees and dues, and this is a common misconception too, because people will say, well, I pay a service fee, so I pay dues, but that's not true. A service fee only covers representational costs. It doesn't cover political activity at all. It doesn't cover some other things, but you know, and it doesn't give you, you know, certain unions, you know, if you only pay a service fee, you don't really have, you're not a member, you're not a full-blown member, and wouldn't have the rights that members have, you know, to have the participation and the
Right.
information that they have. But the service fee is just basically the cost to, you know, represent in bargaining, and also the interests, any activities and things like that that have to do with preserving that contract. That's what that pays for.
And for
As a decent member,
non-members,
you get to vote.
What's that?
I was saying, and also the union has to pay for the non-members' share.
Exactly. And
Right.
that's the thing. You're, as a non-member, you pay a service fee because a union would have to represent you if you brought forth, you know, any grievance, or if you've had anything like that, or if you're just in contract negotiations, they're bargaining for your contract as well as the members' contract.
What was the recent was it Google or Amazon down in North Carolina, I believe, or somewhere down there that
Think
just failed?
Amazon.
Amazon. What's your take? What's the background for us to understand why it failed so well?
I've got my own personal beliefs. You know, I think, you know, the employers really are at the advantage when it comes to Amazon, because they can put all of their resources into efforts to hire people, to hire, you know, those consultants to come in and essentially, you know, break, you know, or bust a union effort. You know, and they can have their employees go in basically as terms of their condition of employment to go sit in a room and talk about how the company's going to take care of them, and they don't want a union because unions just get in the way. You know, and it's kind of that whole thing, and unions just don't have the same access that the employer does, so they're kind of always sort of at that disadvantage, which is why the PRO Act would be so, you know, if employers couldn't sit people down in a room as part of their daily job, and, you know, if they couldn't do that, then unions would have a more fair playing field about, and people actually getting, you know, potentially unbiased information, you know, about unions and what they actually do, and you know, how they aren't a detriment to the company as some would like to think.
I also think, I think Reagan firing the air traffic controllers was a real big chilling effect that still exists today. People
Yeah.
think,
People are afraid, you know, they think
Yeah.
if they're unionized, they'll be retaliated and get fired, because, you know, you have at will employee states where people can just get fired for, you know, just for no apparent reason. You know, they don't need just cause.
Kenzie, you had your hand up.
Hi. I was kind of curious talking about Reagan. I know a lot of people, family members, you know, people in circles. When we're talking about relational organizing, we're talking to everyone in our lives. And I know that a lot of people, especially who lived through the Reagan era, have really absorbed a lot of anti-union rhetoric on corruption, and those union bosses are just as bad. And so in our relational organizing, like, what are things that you've used in your life that have like cut through that deep-seated rhetoric?
Great question.
yeah, it's not
Yeah,
untrue. But I think a good example is public sector unions, Jonathan, which are
Yeah, that's really where it's been, is it's, you know, you've got the strength of unions really lies right now in the public sector. You know, that's one of the biggest hurdles that we have right now, is that you have a whole lot of families out there where people are not growing up with unions and don't know what they are, and all they're hearing about is potentially what their employer is telling them, or employees who are potentially anti-union. And basically the best thing to do is just kind of have a one-on-one conversation with them. You know, I've recruited, you know, just myself. I'm not a paid recruiter or anything like that, but you know, just in the interest of trying to organize folks to build more worker power. really those one-on-one conversations about, and try to make it personal about how a union could affect them and what it could do, to improve their situation and how much of a voice they could have, and if they joined other voices, and how much power you can see. And then, try to give examples of certain actions and things that were successes. It's just showing them a personal example of how a union could benefit them and how, it's benefited other people, I think is pretty effective in a one-on-one conversation.
I think
But
some
to
of
me,
the-
I always let them make the choice, give them the facts, and then really, it's up to them. I don't pressure anybody or do anything like that, because I don't, I know those tactics have been used. I'm not going to say they haven't. But that's, to me, that's not the way I sell unions.
And I'll just say, I come from, like, my grandmother's uncles were union organizers in the early part of the 19th century or 1900s, and they lived in fear for their lives. And we're almost to that point again where it's, organizing labor is such an oppressed thing. But when you are mostly powerful when you can bring these voices together. And Biden he's very pro-labor, very pro-union. Like I said, Reagan had this chilling effect, but what we've seen in the last couple of years, the SEIU, they're doing some great work in organizing lots of different workers. The picture that Jonathan showed, we marched in that, and it was a bunch of people from all over different unions that were trying to get the nurses. Can't even imagine how they feel today, but just a little better working conditions. And if you hear their stories about how their shift work is like, they have no control over their work lives, and they're really mistreated, and they can't raise grievances, and et cetera, et cetera. When you hear that by this collective organizing and striking, really, they were able to make those inroads, because otherwise you don't make any inroads. Your baseline is a net zero. You're only going up from there. So I think that's one thing to think.
Is there's a tie back, isn't there, to some of the jobs in the American Jobs Plan must be union jobs? Is that correct?
I think there are incentives for union jobs in the American Jobs Plan.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think there are portions of the work that they're really pushing toward. It's hard to do because it's state by state, and you don't know where things are, but they are emphasizing these things. So it's, like I said, always carrots and sticks. So you'll see, distressed communities or labor work or small businesses would be preferential to get this kind of work. I get a lot of work because people say I'm a minority woman business enterprise, disadvantaged business, or small business. I think you'll see a lot more of that, like it has to be made in America. On construction, we want to see at least this portion coming from a labor, from labor that's organized.
Yeah, your steel workers, your electrical workers, those, your blue collar
BPW,
jobs, those trade unions are really gonna, they're the ones that are gonna benefit from, the apprenticeship programs and just the the overall increase to their workforce.
The longshoremen,
Great. Well, it is 4:58. We want to respect for your time. Laura, do you want to take us out here today?
I was going to make a editorial comment about Reagan, but that's for a different webinar.
Let me hit the record. Stop the
There's
record.
material there.
Anyway, I want to thank Jonathan. I want to thank Jeannie. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank you if you're watching this at a later date. And I can't wait to see what comes next. Just as this webinar was going on, there was a alert that Jen Psaki sent out that basically they acknowledge that a plan has been put forth by this bipartisan group, and they are going to be meeting at the White House tomorrow. So more to come on that. And so thank you, everybody. Thank you and continue. And if you have not subscribed to updates from Build the Era, please go to buildtheera.com, click on join, and you will then be on our list, which you will get our updated, wonderful, amazing newsletter once a week with all the news that's fit to print. Okay. So thank you guys very much and have a wonderful day.